Well, a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. A very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar. My name is Adrian Reed, and I am really excited to say that today we're joined by Gerry McGovern, who will be presenting a session relating to the way that organisations use digital technology and content, a subject that I'm sure is core to many of our hearts. And he'll be explaining and encouraging us to try a top tasks approach. Before we begin, just a little bit about Gerry. The Irish Times has described Gerry as one of the 5 visionaries who have had a major impact on the development of the web. He's appeared on the BBC, CNN and CNBC television, partaken in various radio shows and featured in numerous print media publications. He's the founder and CEO of Customer Care Words and is on the board of Task Analytics. Today, Gerry will be talking about top tasks, which helps organisations improve customer experience through identifying and optimising customers' top tasks. If you haven't yet seen Gerry's book on this subject, I would highly recommend it. I sat down and read it in about 2 sessions, and I'm normally really easily interruptible, so it's a really practical read. When I did read it, I realised how easy it is to focus on tasks that customers really don't care about. But I better not say too much because I'm sure Gerry will be filling us in. So as we begin the webinar, please do remember that you can submit questions through the Q&A panel. We'll take as many questions as we can at the end, so please do type them in whenever they occur to you, and we'll cover as many as we can at the end. So, with a presentation entitled Digital Transformation or Digital as Usual, the Power of a Top Tasks Approach, Gerry, over to you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Thanks for the kind introduction, and welcome everybody. So, the essence of top tasks is looking into the world of the customer, whatever that customer may be, whether they're buying a car or deciding to go to a university or a developer developing a particular product, and say what is crucial to them, what are the really essential things that they really want and need to do. And as Adrian alluded to, there's this other type of task that we call the tiny tasks, that are often the stuff that gets in the way of them doing what they really need to do. Because one of the core challenges in digital is glut. It's so easy to create stuff, and oftentimes we create stuff from an organization-centric view of the world rather than a customer-centric view of the world. And we make the things that matter most to people often difficult and awkward to find and to do. So this is a philosophy founded on really starting with the customer, the user, and figuring out what's most essential to them and what is not, what's least essential to them, and moving forward from that perspective. One of the ways of moving forward is measuring the top tasks and saying, well, typically in any environment, and we've done this about 500 times over the last 20 years or so, upwards of 500,000 people have been involved in top task processes in 30 to 40 countries. Typically, there's about 10 or so top tasks, 10 things, 5 to 10 things that are really critical in any environment. And then measuring them under 2 key metrics. The completion rate, can people do that thing that they've come to do, and then the time that it took them to do. And these outcome-based metrics, that is how you measure success moving forwards, and I'll be explaining that more as we go through this. So it's a continuous, once you've identified these top tasks, they tend to remain stable, and then you continuously improve the top tasks based on improving their success rate and reducing the time on task. So that's the essence of the top task management model. And in the first phase, it's task identification. So before you measure, you have to identify the top tasks. And this is a research method. It's a specialized survey that has 3 components. The first is the list of tasks, and I'll be explaining where we get these tasks, these important things that matter to people. And the next is the feeling that they have as they're trying to complete these tasks, the experience. So what's challenging them? Is it hard to find the information? Is the information complete? Is it full of jargon? Is it too difficult to do? You know, so the combination of the task and the experience or the feel, and the groups or the demographics or the categories. What categories do they fall into? If we can combine these three components in a survey, we can develop very powerful insights into customer needs and what they want and need to do. So for example, this was a survey about health. So we knew that a top task from the data was mental well-being, stress reduction and mindfulness. And because we had also asked questions about their experience as they tried to find information or solve this sort of issue, and also their demographics, we're able to say that it was most likely to be a top task for the 18 to 24-year-old bracket. That related tasks were harmful habit reduction, diet, food, nutrition, that plain language, so this is the experience as they were trying to complete these tasks, is more important than any of the other 73 tasks. In this overall survey, there were 73 tasks, and mental well-being was one of the top tasks. So you're getting these sorts of insight that they want to be, in particular in dealing with mental well-being, plain language is extremely important. These are, you know, core insights based on what people are trying to do. Men are less likely to rank mental well-being as a top task. So this is powerful, not just for digital, but for understanding human behavior. This is another important task: how to use the health services, getting the care you need. And what we found was that this was more important to those who were over 65, and that cluttered layout, hard to read, are bigger issues than for any of the other tasks. So a core issue of grey text or small fonts, etc., as people get older, etc. So this is giving us insights of, you know, what really matters to people. So I'm going to show you the method of how we get these sorts of deliverables, what the steps are. And the essence of it is that it's a league. It's a league table of importance, from the most important to the least important to people. So here we see here in this health environment that waiting times are the #1 task. Mental well-being, costs and fees, screening, diagnosis, check symptoms. So 7 tasks, you see this yellow, this is the first 25% of the vote. 7 tasks get the first 25% of the vote. They get as much of the vote as the bottom 40. We'll see this later in other breakdowns. And you always get these classical sort of patterns. So waiting times gets 871 votes out of 17,000. And then we go down the list, and we go down, and we see events and conferences get 22 votes out of 17,000. So we see this stark difference between the top and the bottom of the actual environment. And sometimes the top task can get as much votes as the bottom 20 tasks in the process. So this gives us a critical sense of this is what's really important, and this is not what's not so important in this context. And it's not saying that these things at the bottom are not important in some contexts, but in the context of waiting times and mental well-being and costs and fees, these are the critical things. These are the things we must get right, because if we don't get these things right, they're not going to come back for the other stuff, the events and the conference. They're not going to trust us for these other tasks. So getting the foundational tasks, the top tasks right, creates that tremendous foundation upon which you can build other services. But if you don't do the cut and paste well, you don't do the essential things that really matter and that are happening again and again within a particular environment, whether it's a software or whether it's buying a car or whether it's dealing with your health, you're building on very weak foundations. So as you're pulling this task list together, so we saw a big list here, 73 in this environment, medical terms, and get involved in improving health services. Where did we get all these things? Well, I'll show you some of the sources, but what is of most important in the areas where we've seen most change, and we've worked with Toyota and the European Union, many large organizations, Microsoft and Cisco over the years, where we've seen this actually resulting in a better experience and a simpler website and more sales and all the positive metrics was when there was a multidisciplinary team contributing to the creation of this task ecosystem, this task list. So it's much better. The list is developed by people from marketing and digital and support and finance and sales, because they all bring different perspectives and say, oh, you call it that, we call it this, etc. And they become an editorial team for themselves. So if you only do this list in marketing, it's obviously going to be a very marketing oriented list. So you want to get a holistic list that's really focused on the customer and their needs. And one of the best ways to do it is to have representatives from the various customer facing or customer interacting parts of the organization contributing to the evolution, what we call the shortlisting. Because the initial list, when you've done the basic research, maybe 400 or 500 tasks, and then you've got to bring it down to somewhere in the region of 50 to 80. Most of the lists we have are in the region of 50 to 80. One of the things we always try and do in relation to developing the list is to broaden the scope. So years ago, we were working with Lancashire, and we were doing Lancashire County Council. We were doing initial research, and we found that basically information on hospitals and health centres was important to people. And we brought that back and we said, why don't we include that in the list? And they said, no, we're the county council. We don't do that. That's the NHS. That's the National Health Service. That's their area. So we convinced them to leave it in the list. And we went out to the citizens and we asked them to vote, and I'll be explaining the voting process in a few minutes. And it was the number 2 task. And they were initially shocked when they saw this data. They said, what are we going to do? And what they did was they collaborated. They worked with the NHS. So this is their new website. You see how much simpler it is when it's jobs, health and social care, waste, emergencies, libraries and roads. Look at the previous one. Main sections. What sort of a navigation is that? Do it online, your council. The only explicitly useful thing is jobs. What's local information? These are all terrible navigational conventions. Confusing menus and links is the #1 issue that disrupts a good digital journey. That happens time and time again. So a task-based structure tends to be much more efficient, much more focused on customer need and simpler. So that was about 2012. And this, I took a screen grab of it a couple of weeks ago. Tasks have a longevity. So this is a couple of weeks ago I took this screen grab. Still benefits, children, consumer advice, person management, but council, leisure and culture, jobs, health and social care. You get your tasks right. Tasks don't tend to change very much over time. They have a longevity. So you build a foundation based on top tasks. That's a foundation that's going to last for a considerable period of time. So where do you get these initial tasks from? So 80% of your focus should be in customer-facing environments, but you shouldn't ignore the organizational work. So you should look inwards in the organization, the strategy, the stakeholder interviews, etc., for about 20% of adding to this overall list. So remember this initial, what we call long list, maybe 400 or 500 in the process. So where might they come from? Community websites or the external community in interactions and in interviews. For example, we did Microsoft Developer Technologies there a number of years ago. And we went to the independent developer communities and found out what really mattered to them in using type of software from Microsoft. What were their core needs? So experts doing blogs or customers talking about their issues, obviously the web pages of the site, peer or competitors, social media help and support can be excellent sources, often really ignored. Google, the internal search engine, interviews, stakeholders, feedbacks, general analytics. You're trying to look at all the environments where there might be some signs of what people really want to do, so that you can say, we've covered all these bases. Now this takes time. So a task identification process typically takes about 12 weeks to do. And the first 6 weeks are gathering and simplifying the task. Most organizations don't want to do this sort of work, but this pays off in the long term. It gives you really good solid foundations, but it takes time to do it right. It's not something you throw together in an afternoon. You can do that, but you're not going to do it well. You're not going to do it right. You're not going to get good insight from it. So the challenge of, as you're working through the list and as you're simplifying the list, getting it right, getting it, not too high or not too low. So this is, too high facts and figures, conditions. So in a health list, we wouldn't have the conditions, because then we'd have hundreds of conditions. We have all the check symptoms and prognosis, all the things that apply to a condition or a disease, but not the conditions or diseases themselves. Find services, frequently asked health questions. Frequently asked questions are a terrible, terrible, terrible convention for managing content in the process. I don't have time to explain why, but I can give you loads of evidence later if you want. So this is too high, this is too low. Emergency contraception, non-profit agencies, poems and stories about aging. Yeah, I'm sure loads of people are loving to read those in the process. So that's too high, too low, and it's a balancing act. So you can't do this. You're working with this multidisciplinary team, and typically your meetings with them shouldn't be more than a maximum of 2 hours, and you should have about 3 to 5 of those sessions to bring the list down and clean that list up. And we're maybe not perfect, but we're heading in the right direction. So basic facts, causes of a condition, check reliability. So this is heading in the territory of what we would describe as broadly a task. And the word task is just a word to describe the things people really want to do, the things that are really important to them in a particular environment. So we always leave about 20% of the list for the organizational input, and then 5% of that 20% for what we call the ego tasks. Stuff like senior management speeches and annual reports and follow-us on Twitters and videos, because everyone's excited about doing videos in the process. These are formats. Formats should never really be on the list. So you always leave a little bit of stuff for the stuff is a pet subject of somebody really important within the organization, and then you can prove and you can say, well, nobody's voting for this. You got 3 votes out of 10,000 votes, and that's often the result that comes out. So it's a list to get the league, and nobody believes this. Whenever I show this to people, they say this can't work. And this is the world we're in. We have to believe the evidence, not our gut instincts and not our opinions. They often send us in the wrong direction in the process. So it should be about 50 to 80 is the final list. And then you randomly present it. And you ask people to choose up to 5 reasons they come to the OECD, or when they're buying a car, or when they're dealing with their health. Or we did one recently about city transport, urban transport, getting around the city, what really matters to people in the process. So choose up to 5, and we show them the entire list randomly presented. And what happens is the gut instinct of the customer kicks in. They don't really read this list, but if we've done it properly and we've worded it properly in the language of the customer, the stuff that matters to them will jump out in the process. So they'll start seeing the things that really, really matter to them from the list. So we're overloading them deliberately, because often a bad way is to ask customers in a casual, what would you like? And often the things that they say they'd like are not the things that they actually use or need on a day-to-day basis in the process. So often asking customers, you have to be quite careful in this process. So this is getting to the core of what they truly, absolutely need in a specific environment. And every time we do it, we've done it about 500 times, we get this pattern. So you saw there was a list there of 49, 59, 60, 66, 70 tasks in the OECD. And they were all randomly presented to every different person. And yet when they voted on their 4 tasks get as much of the vote as the bottom 49. And then 6 is the 25 to 50. So there's 10 tasks in the top task environment, which is typically, what we find somewhere in that particular territory. Roughly about 10 tasks are the top tasks. So we see what really matters to people and what doesn't matter. We see the top task, the number 1 task, country surveys. The essence of the OECD is about comparing countries. The top task has as many votes as the bottom 28 tasks. And the essence of this is, shouldn't these top tasks be the easiest to find and the easiest to do in any design, whether it's for software or otherwise? Shouldn't the things that have the highest demand and are the most important to the customer, shouldn't those things get most attention from the design process? That's a basic philosophy. So remember earlier I talked about groups and categories. So once you ask these category questions, so you've asked a task list and now you ask them, can we ask you a few extra questions? Which of the following best describe you? So this was years ago we did, before gov.uk came out, we did it for Business Link. Across business in the UK. So once you ask these sorts of category questions, we can say, oh, look, yellows and greens are the top tasks. And we say, well, there's a lot of similarity between self-employed, employed, and starting a business, but there are some differences. For example, managing people is not a top task of people starting a bit, entrepreneurs or businesses starting a business. So we get these insights once we combine the category questions with the top tasks. We get this very powerful insights into are there similarities or are there major differences between subcategories and actual groups? And what we find is there are far more similarities most of the time than there are differences. The organization and the silos within the organization says, no, our customers are totally different. Oh, they're totally different in Austria. And it's not true in a huge number of situations. For example, this is when we did the European Union, the largest project we ever did in 2014. It had 108,000 people voting. Typically, you only need about 400 to get statistically reliable data. But we look across this and we say, hey, all the countries, they all need the same things. They all want the same things: research and innovation, EU law and rules, funding, grants and subsidies, education and training. They all want the same core things. There's a few exceptions, maybe Luxembourg here, but broadly speaking, it's quite identical. And what does that tell us from a design point of view? It tells us we can have the same information architecture and it'll work across geographies and the same content focus. So what we also do in the task identification is we get the internal stakeholders to vote on the survey. So we create a copy of the survey and we ask the surveys, well, what do you think the customer wants to do? This is what the results came out when we did it for the OECD, and we find that there's pretty good empathy here. So 100% would be if the customer voted 5.9% and the team voted 5.9%. But broadly, it's pretty in line with the customer, except for this one, which is overview of what the OECD does. The team thinks it's 4 times more important than the customer does. So often there's these blind spots, these organizational beliefs in what the customer wants, and this gives us an statistically reliable, evidence-based way to defend and say, no, this is what the customer wants, and this is what you think the customer wants, and this is the variance and the difference between the two. So here in the European Commission, even though we did it across 28 countries, 24 languages, still 6 tasks got as much of the vote as the bottom 40 across 108,000 people. And what was very interesting that we found in the method was that at 30 voters, the top 3 tasks had emerged. So the top 3 tasks, research and innovation, funding, grants, and EU law, at 30 voters, they were the top 3 tasks, and at 107,000 voters, they were the same top 3 tasks in the process. So this method very quickly identifies what is critical to people within a particular environment. Sometimes you have what we call the super task. And a super task is a task that gets a huge proportion of the actual vote. So this red line here is the average database from the 400 or 500 top task surveys that we've done. So typically for 65 tasks, the top task should be somewhere in about 8%, but this one is 25% or 23% of the vote. So when you've got a super task, what does that mean from a design point of view? Well, it's kind of like a book of flight. It means that should be front and foremost, that should be immediately doable. when you start off the actual process, when you launch that website or that app or whatever it may be. So that's super task environment, reasonably rare, but does actually happen. So it should dominate the apps architecture. And here we see the black dotted line now is the average here. There's about 40 tasks in this survey, and the top task should be about 13% with about 40 tasks in the survey. But here the top task is only about 5%. So this is a short neck in the process. So what does that indicate? Well, it indicates more a structure like gov.uk, where there's a bunch of top tasks in the environment, no one or two absolutely dominating in the process. So this gives you data of the structural approach, the information architecture approach to take in the design of the navigation and the menus and links in the process. So that's the task identification. Just look at reasonably briefly at task performance indicator. So this is taking the top tasks and taking about 10 of them, no more than 12, and turning them into examples. So in Cisco, the number one task was downloading software. So we created an instruction like download the latest firmware for the RV-over2 router. And then we measured that with network engineers. And so you're measuring instructions connected with the top task and giving them to real people in the process. And then you've got this data which says, oh, we've got a 40% failure rate, and it's taking, here's the time. And this becomes the model of management. How do we reduce the failure rate and reduce the time? How do we make it faster for people to do what they came to do? Because I guarantee you, if you make it faster for people, whether it's delivering them their packages or whatever, it's all about speed today. Task completion, and in the fastest possible time. If you manage people's time, you will do well in digital, and you reduce people's time in the process. So what we found, so typically in the task identification, we look for about 400 people to deliver reliable data. When we do this observational, so this is an observational based approach where we observe people as they're trying to do these tasks, we find you need a much smaller sample set to get reliable data. We found somewhere between 15 and 18. In traditional usability testing, they say if you measure with between 3 and 8 people, you're going to identify core flaws if those flaws exist within the system. However, you will not be able to put a failure rate or an average time on that because the variances will be quite significant. But if you carefully do this and move out to about between 15 and 18 people, you can get reliable data. In other words, you can say this has a 40% failure rate. This is an average of 2.5 minutes to actually complete. So this requires roughly this number of people, because we found we've done hundreds of these studies, and we found it began to stabilize. The success rates or the completion rates or the time and task began to stabilize between about 15 and 18 people. So repetition is key here, that we repeatedly measure the same task over time. And if we're measuring the same task over time and the success rate is changing, then that is because of changes within the environment. So this was a task in Cisco: pretend you've forgotten the password for the Cisco account and take whatever actions are required to log in. So in 2012 was 63%. We made they made some improvements. It went up to 77, went up to 88, then it got to 100%. But digital is never done. The next time we measured it, it dropped to 59% because there was some sort of a bug in the system that was causing a really serious error. They fixed that bug and then went back up to 100%. So measuring, it's very important in this model that you're able to measure the same task over time, and then you can judge the quality of the environment. Is it getting better? Is it delivering a better experience or not? So what we would have is an expected customer journey. So this is a project we did with NetApp. So we say, for this type of task, find a document that gives you the 10 key benefits of NetApp Snapvault. here's where we expect them to go. Here's the expected journey. And then we can measure that against the actual journey and say, well, actually, they didn't go that way in the process. So we're constantly bringing back to the organization the actual experience of the customer and what they're actually doing within the environment, rather than what the organization thinks they're doing, because often there's a significant difference between the two. So then this would be an individual set of results. You want to pay 300 per month over 24 months for a Yaris. So this is made up, this is invented figures. So it's a 40% failure rate, and 40% of those did succeed. We're taking between 2 and 3 minutes in the process. So this gives you a model, and then you got to explain, you got to have your key findings. Well, what are the top 3 reasons that cause this failure rate? And then what are the top 3 things that we can do to fix it? Yeah, but these are just hypotheses. You know, then you measure in 6 months and say, well, is the things that we implemented, those recommendations, did they reduce the failure rate? Oh, they did a bit, but not as much. And then you keep iterating. Digital is never done. It's a constant process of iteration and moving forward. So as you're doing this, as you're observing, you're looking at the 15 to 18 people. If you see one of them do something unusual, well, that's random. You know, you just ignore that. 2 is interesting. So 2 people stopped when they came to filling out the form and were confused by this particular section of the form. Well, that's getting interesting. Once you get more than 3, you've got a finding. You know, we can say, even though there's hundreds of thousands of people downloading software in the Cisco environment, if we find in our measurement sessions that 3 or more are stumbling at a specific point, we can pretty much guarantee that's affecting thousands and thousands of people. So you're looking for patterns or findings in these observation of the behavior. How do we do it? We do it remotely. You don't need to bring them into labs using Zoom or whatever. The closest to their natural environment is better in most situations than bringing them into a lab type of environment. So in their office, in their home, wherever they are, watching them as they complete these tasks and developing the skills of observing the patterns or the findings and developing recommendations from that. So that's a brief overview of the task performance indicator. Sometimes we find that the core, there's a really major problem around the architecture. There's a huge issue around finding stuff. So the organization needs to revisit its navigational architectural approach. So this is a method we use based on the top task data to do that. And the European Commission used this to create this new structure that it has been using since 2015 to organize its information. So we take the top task data, about the 30, not all the 77 or the 80 in the process, because we're creating a sort that is based on the top task. So it's going to be oriented towards the most important stuff. It needs to work for everything in the list, but it's going to be biased, so to speak, against the top task. So typically in a sort, we wouldn't have more than about 30 of the overall, the most voted for things. So we put them into a sort. This is using Optimal Workshop, where we ask, and you only need about 15 or 30 people again here to do this sort of sorting, for them to group the tasks. So we asked them to bring these and put them into groups. So what we found over the years is people are very good at grouping, but they're not very good at naming groups. So never make it compulsory for them to name the groups. Leave that an open option. So once we get 15 to 30 people to do that, patterns begin to emerge. Right? So we see here 87% of the time they group climate change and environmental protection together. 80% of the time they group find a job in another EU country and working in an EU country together. So we begin to see patterns, mental patterns. This is about designing with customers, not designing for customers. The new design is a humble type of design, where we're much more willing to listen and observe actual behavior of what's actually happening. So out of that, as I said, do you remember I said they're not good at naming groups? Our job is to come up with a hypothesis. So this was an initial hypothesis that we come up with of from looking at all those patterns. So the sort is not enough to develop the architecture. You now have to take this hypothesis and test it. And the way you take it and test it is you take it, you create instructions, simplified instructions based on your top task. So this is an example from Toyota, where we did the task identification across 15 countries, and then we did the architectural, customer architecture design in 2 countries to see were there differences between the countries in how they would organize stuff. So one of the key challenges for Toyota was the specifications, the features and specifications. It was a challenge for people to find the specifications. And when we did the sort, we noticed that there was this pattern around space, boot space, seating capacity, seats, legroom. And it was the exact same pattern. We did this in the UK and we did it in Norway. Obviously in Norway it was in Norwegian, but it was the exact same pattern that occurred in both countries. And then we came up with this classification called Plass og Coupe in Norwegian and space and room in the UK. But that was a hypothesis that we would bring out to test with other elements of the structure. So here we found what are the boot dimensions for a Yaris. So obviously that was in Norwegian when it was tested in Norwegian. We said, oh, Plass og Coupe, it really worked. Yeah, 95% of the time they clicked on that. That's where we expected them to go for the boot dimensions of the Yaris. And equally, it worked very well in the UK. 94% of the time they clicked on space and room. So you think, oh, that's wonderful. But you need to test these structures with multiple tasks, because sometimes there are hidden problems. A classification may work very well for something, but it may work really badly for another type of task. So when we tested a task like, does air conditioning normally come with a Prius in Norwegian, and we had a huge failure rate. We didn't expect or want people to click on Plass og Coupe, but 53% of them did click on it. So we knew we had a real problem there. And immediately when we showed this data to the Norwegians, they said, we see what the problem is. Coupe can have a much broader meaning in Norwegian. It can mean interior. So just change it to Plass in the process. So in the next round, so you need about 3 rounds of this to really root out the issues from the customer's point of view. We changed it to Plass, and it dropped. The negative dropped by 53% to 0. It was no longer what we call a dirty magnet in the process. So typically, you go through, you create your sort based on your top task, you get your hypothesis, and you go through 3 rounds of testing to get, and your target rate is getting to over 80% success rate. So in other words, they're clicking on the right, they're heading in the right direction. They're clicking on space and room when they should click on space and room to get those dimensional, or to get those space or boot space type of information. So the model identify what's critical to people, and continuously measure and evolve your top tasks based on feedback. So you're getting those top tasks up to 90+% success rates and the shortest possible times to complete those tasks. And when you're doing that, when you have your top task in super performance mode, you can do lots of other stuff because you've got trust, you've got use, you've got lots of traffic, etc. Because people are coming there to do these things that they really need to do, knowing they can do them quickly and easily. And that makes them more likely then to want to do other things with you. So that's an overview of the top task method. As Adrian said at the beginning, we are now open to questions and comments and observations or whatever. I think we've got about 20 minutes left. So we'd be delighted to hear any questions that you might have.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and thank you very much, Gerry, for covering so much in such a short period of time. Some really practical insight there. So please do. We've got questions coming in. We'll take as many questions as we can in the time. So even if you haven't got your question typed in yet, feel free to type it in. So Gerry, the first question we have is a fairly specific one, and it's about some terminology, and it is, what is a dirty magnet?
Well, a dirty magnet is a navigational link that draws clicks when it shouldn't. So it's like resources or frequently asked questions. So frequently asked questions is a classical dirty magnet. Because how does the customer know their question is frequently asked or not? They'll click on it in the hope that their question might be there. So it's a vague type of thing. So a link can have both a negative and a positive purpose. It can send you in the wrong direction or it can send you in the right direction. So main sections or tools. Oh, isn't everything a tool these days? These are what I would call classic dirty magnets. They're links that kind of that are in the eye of the beholder, kind of multiple meanings. So the best links, jobs means jobs. Jobs doesn't mean waste. But local information could mean jobs, or it could mean waste, or it could mean roads. So tasks a great link tends to tell you what it is, but equally tells you what it's not. Whereas a dirty magnet tells you, yeah, it could be over here. Why not click? Another classic dirty magnet would be quick links. Doesn't everyone want to click on a quick link? I mean, who wants to click on a slow link in the process? So these are links that draw clicks for all sorts of things, because they look like they might be the right way to go, but in essence they become a website within a website, or an app within an app, or a dumping ground.
So almost like I'm thinking of an analogy here, Gerry. It's almost like a confusing sign in a building, which means you take a wrong, or like a bad sat nav direction, which takes you down a wrong road. That type of thing.
Yeah, or a link that says everything you want to find.
Right.
Like, oh, but actually that doesn't include the canteen.
Yeah.
That's a marketing campaign we had, but that's really about the environment, but we call it everything you want to find. The organizations and departments and silos, they often come up with names for themselves that are much bigger than their functionality.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, fantastic, thank you. So we have a couple of one comment and one related question, so I'll bundle these two together. The first comment is this is a comment, not a question. I really like the point about pulling together multidisciplinary teams made up of people who are customer facing. Too often only internal stakeholders are selected, and I know I've certainly experienced that. I suspect many people tuning in will have experienced that. But on a related comment, the question is, how many people should be on a multidisciplinary team? I suspect that's a sort of how big is a piece of string question, but any guidance?
Generally, we found over the years, right, and obviously it depends on the size of the organization, but 5 to 8 people is somewhere optimal. And what is very important is that they're on the team throughout the process. So because this is a kind of a complicated process, simple on the surface, but complicated enough to get from the long list to the short list. So let's say you have a long list of 400 tasks and you have your first shortlisting session and you clean it up and you get rid of 50 to 80 tasks through a consensual based process. Then your next session is the following Tuesday and there's 4 new people. Well, you got to explain the process, and then they're saying, well, what about this and what about that? So you need consistency. So we tend to break it up into 2 sections. We look for people who have good experience but can stay the distance. And then if we know there's really good people, but we can only get them once, then we use them near the end of the process as a final review and quality assurance. So typically 3 to 8 people is a good enough, because they play off each other. The HR don't get all their tasks in because marketing says, well, I don't understand that, and it kind of creates a balance as we bring in these different groups and different perspectives. And we've often heard people have come up to me and said, that's the first time I've understood our organization in a holistic way. Like, it seems like a simple process, but actually discussing these things of what do we call it? Is this overlapping with this, etc., are actually quite foundational questions. Once you get that proper commitment, it's a very useful process. But somewhere between 3 and 8, we often find is optimal.
Fantastic. And then I guess with 8, it's small enough to not become a huge committee that spends time, too much time deliberating, so it's still manageable. And fantastic. So the next question is, it's sort of three related questions bundled together. The question is what it says. Great webinar, Gerry. Thank you. Have you ever come across a situation where a couple of audience groups did in fact have very different top tasks rankings? And how did you design for this? And what are your thoughts on using personalization as a way to address these situations?
Yeah, good questions. The task list, the results are a kind of a starter kit for personalization. So, you know, they really feed into to give you the initial starter structure if you've got. Now, yes, you will get situations where we find much more likely to be difference is between roles rather than geographies or things like that. So a network engineer in Germany is going to have a lot more in common with a network engineer in the United States than often a marketing person in Germany will have with a network engineer, you know, in Germany. So sometimes we see role differences. Depending on your role, you can have different tasks. And these are, and sometimes significantly different tasks. And these, of course, absolutely lead to that personalization type of model. But even there, you often have two or three super or top tasks that run across. But if you have absolute differences, yes, you're looking at moving people off into their sections as quickly as possible. However, I would say be very, very careful about creating structures based on roles or based on personas. Because they have multiple problems in the because people can often flip between roles and personas. Like when you go to Dell, do you think, oh, I'm a small business person, or do you think I want to buy a laptop? You know, people don't think in the persona. They don't think I'm a mother with 4 children. They think I need to buy shoes. You know, so often personas are not an intuitive model from a customer perspective to actually navigate through a particular process. So yes, the personalization model that you know something about them and you can show them a structure that reflects their model, but the top task results should give you a good starter kit for that personalization model.
Fantastic. I'm smiling, Gerry, a lot as you were mentioning that Dell example, because with an electronics or a computer provider, I had a very, very similar experience where I'd gone for some support with something that had broken, and because I worked for a small business, I'd gone through the small business route. But it turns out, because we'd only bought one of them, we bought them through the retail route. So I consider myself small business because I'm at work, but they consider me retail because we'd only bought one of them.
Yeah. And this is the crazy, and you get these crazy type of models that involve internally, the way the organization is siloed, and so you had a really annoying, painful experience.
Yeah. It involved being transferred multiple times, but I'm sure we've all had those sorts of challenges. So, okay, so the next question, and this question was asked relatively early in the webinar, so I think you've probably already addressed this, Gerry, but I'll just see if you've got any more to add on this. But the question is, are you able to explain how top tasks is different to or similar to card sorting?
Yeah, it actually evolved out of card sorting. I used to do a lot of card sorting workshops, but it's a much more, in a way, system. It's a league, so you get a hierarchy of actual importance coming out of it. Whereas in card sorting, you get people to work through and group these cards, etc. in the pro, and that can be a very valuable process. And in fact, the sorting process that I showed as the first step of the customer architecture is card sorting. So it's first and foremost deciding, well, what should those cards be? Because that's not a simple thing. And that's what we spend 6 weeks. What should the groups be? But getting that, hierarchy from you got all these 50 or 70 cards, or things or tasks or whatever. And we call them cards because we used to do them manually on cards, but it's no longer that model. But it's a kind of an evolution from card sorting in that it gives you a hierarchy and a league table, and it tells this task is 28 times more important than this one. Because often what we find at the bottom of the list is what I call the tiny tasks, and that there's an inverse relationship. When we map organizational behavior to the league table, we find often there's more activity happening at the bottom of the list than there is at the top of the list. And the reason I find that that's true is that I say that when a tiny task goes to sleep at night, it dreams of being a top task. and it's got a little bit of budget, and it's got a senior manager behind it, and it's going to push like hell to get more attention, etc. So often the tiny tasks are like needy children in the process, and the top task league table identifies them and says, listen, these are not that important to our customers. Why are we spending so much time and attention on them, and why are we neglecting the top task?
Absolutely. And in fact, that leads us on really nicely to the next question, which is, even with your thorough surveying and analysis, have you ever faced denial amongst the executive decision makers of the top tasks you have identified, i.e. they ignore a top task that you've identified and they implement a tiny task instead? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, 50% of the time.
Wow.
Yeah, and then that's, oh, great, yeah, wonderful, yeah, and then, because, it's the nature of organizations. Like I've worked in more than 30 countries now at this stage, and I have never been in an organization that has come to me and said, help us become more organization centric. We're too focused on our customers. We need to focus on ourselves a bit more. It's never ever happens. So there's a tremendous internal pressure of organizational ego and what we want you to do, in the process, rather than what you, and the sense of we control you and we control your journey in the process. So I would say, 50% of the time, the projects that we do ultimately, either fail or achieve maybe 20% of what they could achieve, because the organization just refuses to and says, no, we're going to get a big marketing campaign behind, we're going to dominate this page or this environment, or we're going to force, as one said to me recently, I said, and the homepage and the homepage structure. And I said, yeah, but today everyone goes through search. Can't we control the homepage? Can't we at least put all the stuff that nobody wants on the homepage? And I said to them, that's why nobody goes to the homepage, because you put all that stuff in it in the first place. That's why they had to learn to get better at search, because your architecture was so bad. You were trying to force them, but they said, but at least give us the impression that we're controlling stuff. At least leave us the homepage that nobody visits anymore, so that we can at least feel we're in control of the customer and their journey. So there's all that delusional behavior that is in 80-90% of the organizations out there, as and leaving it open to the 10% of organizations like Google and Amazon and whatever that truly do focus and obsess about their customers.
Wow. That's really interesting, Gerry. As you were saying there, I was thinking about a phrase that I've heard a few times with organizations I've worked with and for, and it's always a phrase which you learn to listen for these things. And it's always, for me, it rings sort of bells. It's the we need to educate the customer,
Yeah.
so that they can do this. It's not a problem with the process. We just need to educate the customer better. And there's sort of the contrarian thinking that comes in. It's like, yeah, or you could just make it easier.
Yeah, and sometimes it's true, but you won't educate the customer by screaming and shouting at them and making it really difficult for them to do what they came to do.
Yeah.
After they came and did it really easily, if because they know what they've come to do, and if you make that really easy, or you're going through and you're saying, and they're saying, oh, I need 20 of this, and then you say to them, oh, but if you bought one of these new things, it would do the same job as those 20. If you do it in a subtle way, that you still allow them to go on their journey, but you make the journey better, or at a very appropriate moment, you say, well, there's actually a better option.
Yeah.
Rather than a huge big banner on the homepage saying, buy this, watch our video, etc. You got to first and foremost go on the journey that the people are on and make that journey better, rather than try and change their journey. So sometimes it's legitimate to, quote unquote, educate the customer, but a lot of the times it's just this, egotistical, I want to be in control of this environment.
Absolutely. Okay, so our next question is somewhat related to context. And the question is, I'm a small business advisor, and the presentation was largely based on large organizations with large amounts of data. How can the digital transformation process work for small businesses? So in small businesses, Gerry, would this approach work?
Well, the basic philosophy, of focusing on the essence of the task, rather than, what the organizational wants from the customer, is still relevant. So obviously with smaller data, but even I said, like with 30 or 40 people, the top tasks that emerged in the European Union, the same as at 107,000 people. So even with relatively small numbers, however, the issue is that with small businesses, often the task list is much smaller. So this is generally a technique used for larger, more complicated environments. But it can work in smaller environments where there are a lot of options. But the basic philosophy, when we're getting looking around recently, getting somebody to clean their house, you go to all these websites, and they've got a bit better over the years, but they're still telling you, we clean your house so you don't have to. Pictures of children running in fields with happy dogs and spend more. But I know that. I would be at your bloody website if I wasn't trying to save time. So they're telling you about how much you can do with your time and how they care about your time. Yeah, but they don't care about my time, because what I care about is how much they cost. Are they in my geographic area? And are they available to clean next Tuesday or Thursday or the process? So often these core tasks of what do you cost? Do you cover my area? Have you got availability? But no, they're showing me ridiculous cliche images of smiling, happy families, who have presumably saved time by hiring them. But often these things are the organizational ego. They're answering the wrong question. I already know I want to save time. What I want to know is the price. Or often, the tasks are very basic things. They're things that you don't want, or you think they're so basic you don't want to tell them. But we often discover that the really essential stuff are really bread and butter basic things that a website should do and often doesn't do.
And that's a really, really useful point to highlight. And that really highlights that importance of empathy and understanding the customer. So, Gerry, thank you so much. We are just about to hit the end of our hour. So just before we close, I'm certain that people will want to stay in touch with you. I've mentioned the book already, but what's the best way for people to stay in touch with you, whether it's on Twitter or a blog? And also, where's the best place for people to buy your book?
Yeah, then they'll find it on Amazon or actually on lulu.com, there's a 40% discount on it. And GerryMcGovern.com and Gerry McGovern on Twitter will definitely get me. And I do a weekly newsletter. I've been doing it for 20 years now. There's a sign-up process on GerryMcGovern.com talking about these sorts of issues and related stuff.
Fantastic, and I'd highly recommend check out Gerry's blog. There are many interesting articles, but one that Gerry published a week or so ago about the environmental cost of digital content, which I'd never considered before, but it's a fascinating read. So do go on and take a look at that as well. So fantastic. Well, the final thing to say is a huge thank you, Gerry, for speaking on the webinar. It's been really interesting, and I'm certain everyone who's tuned in live has found it useful, and those watching the recording will have done as well. Also, a massive thank you to everyone who has tuned in, whether you're watching the recording or whether you're watching live. If you are watching the live version, we do have a webinar coming up in June, which when you click out of this webinar, you'll be invited to register for should you wish. It's on June the 13th, and it's 10 a.m. UK time. That's 10 a.m. British summer time. The reason that there's a slightly different time for that one is our speaker is in Australia. So finding the time slot is always a bit more tricky. That is a webinar entitled The Mindful BA, Building Resilience Through Mindfulness with Kathy Burkidge. And I met Kathy at a conference, was really, really impressed with her enthusiasm on the topic. So if you can make it, it'd be fantastic to see you there. Also, this session is being recorded, so within about 24 hours, the recording will be available. So if you had colleagues that missed it, feel free to pass it on. And the only final thing to say is you will get just a really, really short survey after this session. Would be very, very grateful if you could fill it in. One particular field on that survey asks what topics you'd like to see. And as a reminder, really the idea behind the BA community webinars is to perhaps cover topics that we don't normally talk about in the BA community. So if you've got some ideas or even ideas for speakers, please put them in that survey, and we'll do everything we can to get those webinars for you. So until next time, good evening, and thanks again, Gerry, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.